Some people grew up in houses that were clean and functional. There was food on the table. The bills were paid. Nobody screamed. Nobody hit. There was nothing you could point to and say, that is where the damage happened. And yet, something was always slightly off. A particular kind of silence lived in the walls. Not the silence of peace, the silence of things unspoken, feelings that had no home, questions that never got asked. A child who slowly, without ever being told, learned that the deepest parts of them were not welcome here. Nothing you could point to, and yet, something you still feel. If that lands somewhere specific in you, not like a memory, but like a weight you've carried your whole life without knowing its name, then keep watching. Because this isn't about chaos. This is about absence. And absence leaves marks that are harder to explain because they have no shape. They're the shape of what was never there. Emotionally distant parents are not always cold. They are not always cruel. Many of them worked hard. Many of them loved their children in the way they understood love, as provision, as protection, as being present in the room. They fed you. They drove you places. They showed up. But they didn't ask what you were thinking. Not really. They didn't sit with you in your confusion or your sadness. They didn't look at you with genuine curiosity, not at the world inside you, only at your performance in the world outside. Grades, behavior, how you appeared to others. When you were excited about something, they nodded. When you were hurting, they told you it would pass. When you needed them to just stay in the feeling with you for a moment, they left. Not physically, just inward. The shutters came down. The conversation moved on. They took care of you. They just didn't know you. And you learned very early that being understood was not something you could expect. A child cannot process this as a failing in the parent. A child's mind is not built for that kind of distance. So instead, it does what children always do. It turns inward, and it adapts. The child doesn't think, my parent is emotionally unavailable. The child thinks, something about me is too much, or not enough, or wrong, in some way they can't quite name. So they adjust. They become easy. They stop crying loudly. They stop asking for reassurance. They learn to shrink their needs down to a size that feels manageable, invisible, safe. They start performing wellness instead of feeling it. I'm fine. Everything is fine. Because that is the version of themselves that gets warmth, or at least the absence of withdrawal. Achievement becomes a language. If I am impressive enough, helpful enough, quiet enough, good enough, maybe I'll get through. Maybe something in them will finally open. But here is what most people miss about this stage. You didn't just become easy to love. You became someone who needed less, or at least learned to pretend you did. You stopped showing the fullest parts of yourself, not because those parts disappeared, but because no one came when you did. And then they grow up, and they carry all of that into the world, into their friendships, their careers, their relationships, and they wonder why certain things feel so hard. Emotions, for instance, not other people's emotions, their own. They can hold space for everyone around them. They can read a room like a book. They can intuit what other people need before those people have spoken a word. But if you ask them what they feel, not what they think, not what they should feel, but what is actually happening in their body right now, they will often go quiet. There's a blankness there, a kind of fog, like trying to look directly at something that keeps moving. They learned early that their feelings weren't relevant data, so they stopped collecting it. Not all at once, not consciously, just slowly enough that one day, being disconnected from yourself feels normal. In relationships, the pattern is specific and painful. They are often drawn, almost magnetically, to people who don't quite reach them. People who are emotionally unavailable, busy, inconsistent, difficult to read. Not because they enjoy the pain of it, but because that particular dynamic is familiar. And familiarity, even when it hurts, carries the comfort of something known. They don't trust love when it arrives easily, because nothing important ever came easily before. Consistent love, easy, available, patient love, makes them nervous. It's too bright. They don't know what to do with it. They wait for the catch. They test it without meaning to. They wonder when it will disappear, or ask something of them they can't give. They overgive, not out of confidence, but out of a quiet, persistent belief that they have to earn their place. That love is not something you receive. It's something you work for, constantly, without ever quite finishing the job. And underneath all of it, there is a fear they rarely name. They don't fear losing people as much as they fear finally being fully seen and then rejected anyway. after everything, after all the performing and shrinking and earning, that the real version of them, the one they've been protecting, would still not be enough. Their independence reads as strength, and it is in some ways. They figure things out. They don't collapse easily. They build capacity in themselves because they learned very early that relying on someone else was an uncertain business. But ask them to ask for help. Ask them to admit they are struggling. Ask them to let someone else carry something for a while. Watch what happens. The resistance isn't stubbornness. It's terror, dressed up as competence. Because needing people is something they were quietly taught to distrust. Not with words, with experience. They will manage everything and say nothing and quietly come apart somewhere private where no one has to see it. There are things they believe about themselves that they have never said out loud. Some of them have never thought directly, but the beliefs are there, running underneath everything, like water under floorboards. My feelings are an inconvenience. If people really knew me, what I need, what I want, the depth of what I feel, they would leave. I am fundamentally difficult to love. Needing people is weakness, and weakness is a kind of shame. But there is one that cuts deeper than the rest, and it rarely gets spoken because it is too precise and too painful to hold in the light for long. They don't just believe they are hard to love, they believe they are only tolerable in small doses, that there is a version of them, the full, unguarded, genuinely needing version, that would be too much for anyone to stay for, so they never let anyone see it. Here is the part that is hardest to explain. This is not grief for something lost. You cannot lose what you never had. It is grief for something that was always just out of reach, warmth that was present but withheld, connection that was possible but never quite arrived. The loss is in the gap between what was and what should have been, a gap with no visible edges, no clear event, no memory to point to, just a feeling that something important never happened. No villain in the story, just a slow, quiet accumulation of moments where a child looked up and found no one looking back. That is its own kind of wound, harder in some ways than recognizable pain, because the world around you will tell you that you should be fine. You were fed, you were safe, you survived. And they are right, you survived. But surviving and being seen are not the same thing, and a part of you has always known the difference. What matters now, and this is not advice, this is just the truth, is that these patterns made sense. They were not flaws, they were solutions. The child you were built the most elegant architecture they could with the materials they had. Walls where there should have been windows. Distance where there should have been reach. You can look at that now. You can name it without shame. You can begin to understand that the parts of you that pull back, that overperform, that cannot quite receive love without waiting for it to be taken away, they were doing their job, protecting you, making you small enough to survive something large. And they don't have to keep doing that job forever. You didn't become this way by accident. You adapted, quietly, carefully, completely, to a silence that taught you how to disappear without ever leaving the room. And the hardest part is this. No one ever told you that you were allowed to be fully seen, so you learned to live without it. And some part of you is still waiting, still hoping in the way children hope, even when they know better, that someone will look closely enough to finally find what was always there.